They beat her daughter into a coma and thought she'd stay quiet. But what they didn't count on was a mother's fury and her fight for justice. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a politician. She was just a black woman tired of watching the system destroy her people. So she stood up alone and took down the entire police department. This isn't fiction. This really happened. And her story will stay with you long after the last word. Stay with us because this story deserves to be heard from beginning to end. Tanya's morning started like any other, packing her daughter's lunch, rushing through her routine, sipping coffee that had already gone cold. She had no idea her life was about to split in two, the moment before the call, and everything after. Her daughter, Alia, just 14, was walking home from school when a police cruiser pulled up beside her. No warning, no explanation, just flashing lights and shouted commands. They said she fit the description, a phrase that black families know too well. Alia tried to ask why, tried to stay calm, but the officers didn't see a child. They saw a problem, and within seconds they slammed her to the ground. Her body hit the concrete like it didn't matter. It all happened in front of a crowd, phones recording, people screaming, but none of it stopped the violence. When Tanya got the call, no one gave her details, just that her daughter was injured and at the hospital. Her heart dropped. She raced there, barely breathing, praying it wasn't as bad as it sounded. But nothing could prepare her for what she saw. Alia lay unconscious in a hospital bed, bruises on her face, tubes in her nose, monitors tracking each slow breath. A doctor stood quietly by the door, avoiding eye contact. A nurse leaned in and gently whispered she didn't deserve this. Tanya couldn't move, couldn't speak. She just stood there, staring at her baby, broken and still. Her mind spun in circles. How could this happen? Why her? Why like this? The only thing louder than the beeping machines was the rising scream inside her chest. And in that moment, Tanya made herself a silent promise they were not going to bury this truth. The police report came in 2 days later. It was cold, vague, and full of holes. It claimed Alia had been resisting arrest, that officers used reasonable force to detain her. Tanya read the words over and over, her hands shaking. None of it made sense. Alia was quiet, thoughtful, always avoided confrontation. Tanya knew her daughter. That report was a lie. She went to the precinct for answers, but no one wanted to talk. The officers involved, not available. The body camera footage, under review. Security footage from the corner store nearby, accidentally erased. Every door she knocked on was either locked or slammed shut. But Tanya didn't back down. If anything, the silence made her more determined, because she could feel it. This wasn't just about her daughter. This was about a system that expected her to stay quiet. But Tanya had no intention of being quiet. Tanya began documenting everything, every unanswered question, every contradiction. She kept a notebook in her bag, a spreadsheet on her laptop, and a growing folder of names, dates, and medical reports. Her grief had sharpened into focus. While other parents might have collapsed under the weight of it all, Tanya turned her pain into fuel. She started reaching out first to local reporters, then to activists. Most didn't return her calls. Some said the story was too sensitive, but one young journalist agreed to meet. Tanya told her everything, every detail, every wound. The story aired late at night on a small station, barely a blip on the news cycle. But that one report cracked something open. The next morning, Tanya's inbox was full. Strangers reached out, other black parents, former officers, people who had seen things but never spoken. And just like that, Tanya realized she wasn't alone in this. One message stood out among the rest. It was from a former officer who had worked in the same department. The email was short, anonymous, and chilling. Your daughter wasn't the first. This has been happening for years. Check internal complaints from 2016 onward. Tanya read it 3 times, then sat in silence. Her instincts had been right. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. A cover-up. She requested public records, filed formal complaints, and started connecting the dots. Names repeated. Incidents overlapped. Officers transferred suddenly or resigned quietly. Victims disappeared from reports. It was all there in plain sight, if you knew how to look. Tanya stayed up late night after night, building a case piece by piece. Not as a lawyer, not as an investigator, but as a mother who refused to let the system swallow her child and spit out a lie. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about truth. Tanya started showing up at every city council meeting. She sat in the front row, holding a photo of Alia bruised, unconscious, innocent. At first they ignored her. The mayor thanked her for her concern. The police chief avoided eye contact. But she kept coming. Week after week she spoke during public comment, voice shaking but steady, forcing them to hear her daughter's name. And slowly others began to stand with her. A teacher came forward about a student who'd been roughed outside the same school. A janitor admitted he saw officers tampering with security cameras. The crowd grew. Each meeting, more people stood beside Tanya. No more silence. No more shame. The community began to realize this wasn't just about one child. It was about all of them. And Tanya, once just a mother alone in a hospital room, was becoming something more. A leader. A threat to the very system that tried to silence her. As the pressure mounted, the department finally responded with denial. The police chief held a press conference blaming misinformation and public hysteria. He claimed the officers had followed protocol. But Tanya came prepared. She stood on the courthouse steps the next day, flanked by other families and community members, holding a binder thick with evidence. Dates, complaints, photos, medical records, witness statements. She spoke calmly, clearly, and let the facts speak for themselves. Reporters started listening. National outlets picked up the story. What began as a single mother's fight was turning into a reckoning. Tanya wasn't chasing attention, she was demanding accountability. And the louder the city tried to dismiss her, the more the people rallied around her. She didn't just expose a corrupt department. She exposed how often this system counts on black women to suffer in silence. But not this time. Behind closed doors, city officials began to panic. Internal emails leaked conversations about controlling the narrative and protecting departmental integrity. But Tanya had already changed the narrative. She filed a civil lawsuit against the department, naming not just the officers involved but the leadership that enabled them. At first, legal experts said she had little chance. The department was powerful. The union was even stronger. But Tanya wasn't fighting alone anymore. Civil rights attorneys offered to help pro bono. Community organizers raised funds. Protesters filled the courthouse steps with chants of Alia's name. The city offered a quiet settlement money with no admission of guilt. Tanya refused. This wasn't about a check. It was about truth, transparency, and change. She looked at the men in suits across the table and said, "My daughter's life has value, and I'm not leaving until the world knows it." As Tanya's case moved forward, something unexpected happened. Officers within the department began coming forward. Some anonymously, others publicly. They shared stories of misconduct swept under the rug, complaints that vanished, and a culture that punished anyone who spoke out. One officer broke down in tears during a deposition, admitting he'd watched a colleague hurt a teenager and had been told to let it go. The web of silence was unraveling. Tanya sat through hours of testimony, each story adding weight to her own. It was painful, but it was power. The truth was no longer hers alone, it belonged to the community. Local politicians, once silent, began calling for reform. The police chief resigned. 2 officers were placed on administrative leave. It wasn't justice, not yet, but it was movement. And for Tanya, every small crack in the wall felt like breath after suffocation. She was turning their silence into sound. Even as the system began to bend, Tanya knew better than to believe it would break on its own. She'd seen how quickly headlines fade, how justice is delayed until the world forgets. So she kept pushing. She organized town halls and invited families who'd been silenced. She started a local coalition focused on police accountability, staffed entirely by volunteers, many of them mothers like her. They called themselves the Alia Initiative. Their mission was simple: expose the truth, support the victims, and fight for lasting change. The work was hard. The threats came often: anonymous calls, slashed tires, even a brick thrown through her window. But Tanya refused to flinch. Fear had already taken too much from her. This time she would not bow. Because every time she looked at her daughter still recovering, still fighting, she was reminded that survival wasn't enough. They deserved to live, to breathe, to be safe. The Aliyah initiative quickly grew beyond Tanya's neighborhood. Word spread on social media, then to national podcasts, then to major news outlets. Other cities reached out, asking how to replicate what she'd built. Tanya, once a quiet mother in the background, was now leading panels at universities and testifying before legislative committees. But fame was never the goal. Her focus stayed on the people still suffering in silence: black mothers afraid to speak, teenagers traumatized by uniforms, families buried in red tape. Each time she stepped to a microphone, she carried their stories too. And yet, through it all, she kept coming home to Aliyah. The road to recovery was long. There were days when her daughter didn't want to talk or couldn't remember simple things. But there were also small victories, smiles, laughter, progress. Tanya clung to those moments, because for all the noise outside, her greatest battle was still inside that house. The Aliyah initiative quickly grew beyond Tanya's neighborhood. Word spread on social media, then to national podcasts, then to major news outlets. Other cities reached out, asking how to replicate what she'd built. Tanya, once a quiet mother in the background, was now leading panels at universities and testifying before legislative committees. But fame was never the goal. Her focus stayed on the people still suffering in silence, black mothers afraid to speak, teenagers traumatized by uniforms, families buried in red tape. Each time she stepped to a microphone, she carried their stories too. And yet, through it all, she kept coming home to Aliyah. The road to recovery was long. There were days when her daughter didn't want to talk or couldn't remember simple things. But there were also small victories, smiles, laughter, progress. Tanya clung to those moments, because for all the noise outside, her greatest battle was still inside that house. The trial date finally arrived. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, city officials, and ordinary citizens who had followed Tanya's journey from the beginning. But Tanya didn't care about the cameras. She only cared about the truth being spoken out loud in a space that had tried so long to bury it. One by one, witnesses testified. Medical experts, bystanders, even reluctant officers. The defense tried to paint Aliyah as aggressive, tried to justify the brutality. Tanya sat still, jaw clenched, refusing to be broken by their narrative. Then, it was her turn. She took the stand, looked each juror in the eye, and told them what it meant to raise a black child in America, what it meant to fear sirens instead of feel protected by them. Her voice didn't shake. Her pain was steady. By the time she stepped down, the room was silent. Not out of shock, but out of reverence for a mother who turned her grief into fire. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Tanya didn't sleep. She paced the house, cleaned the same counter 3 times, sat beside Aliyah just watching her breathe. When the verdict finally came, she stood in that courtroom holding her breath, not just for herself, but for every family who'd ever been told to wait for justice that never came. The officers were found guilty on multiple counts: excessive force, misconduct, falsifying reports. It wasn't everything Tanya hoped for, but it was more than anyone expected. People wept in the gallery. Some cheered. Tanya did neither. She simply closed her eyes and let the weight begin to lift, slowly, after carrying it for so long. This wasn't closure. There would never be full closure for what they'd done to Aliyah. But it was recognition. It was truth, spoken out loud with consequences attached. And in this system, that in itself was a revolution. A crack in the armor. In the weeks that followed the verdict, policies began to shift. The department announced new oversight measures. Officers were required to complete de-escalation training. A civilian review board was formed with Tanya offered a seat at that seat. She declined. "I don't need a seat," she said. "I built the table." Instead, she focused on expanding the Aliyah initiative, turning it into a national platform. She traveled to other cities, met with grieving families, and taught them how to build power from pain. Her story became a blueprint, not because it ended in victory, but because it never lost its heart. Tanya didn't ask for this fight. It found her. And she rose not just for her daughter, but for every black woman who's ever been told to wait, be quiet, or endure. She refused all 3. Because survival isn't just staying alive. Sometimes, survival is raising your voice until the walls begin to shake. Aliyah's recovery was slow, uneven, and full of hard days. Physical therapy pushed her to tears. Nightmares pulled her awake. But there was progress, real, steady progress. She started drawing again, then journaling, then speaking at small youth events her mother hosted. At one event, a young boy asked her if she was scared. Aliyah paused, then answered, "Yes, but I did everything right. And I'm still here." That moment echoed louder than any speech. Tanya watched her daughter transform from a victim into a voice. Not just a symbol, but a survivor. And that meant more than any courtroom win. Because the fight had always been about her. Not just justice for what was taken, but protection for who remained. Every time Aliyah walked into a room and held a red hay, Tanya saw the victory. Not in punishment, but in resilience. In healing. In refusing to be erased. They didn't just survive the system. They rewrote their place in it. By now, Tanya's name was known across the country, but she never let it change her. She still packed lunches, still braided Alia's hair, still walked her to doctor's appointments. Fame wasn't the point. It never had been. What mattered was the shift. She could feel black mothers speaking louder, communities standing stronger, systems being questioned instead of blindly obeyed. And still, Tanya carried the weight of the ones who didn't get this ending. The mothers who buried sons. The families still waiting for answers. She lit candles for them, spoke their names, centered their stories. Because her victory didn't erase their grief, it made her honor it even more. This wasn't about becoming a hero. It was about being human in a world that often denies black women that very thing. Tanya fought to make sure no other woman would have to choose between being heard and being safe, and that was a legacy no one could silence. One morning, Tanya stood at the edge of a school auditorium, watching Alia prepare to speak to a group of high school students. The same girl who had once laid in a coma was now standing tall, note cards in hand, voice clear. Tanya didn't cry, she just smiled, deep and quiet, the kind of smile born from surviving storms. Alia spoke about truth, about fear, about the power of being believed. The students listened, really listened. Some cried, some clapped. Afterward, a young girl hugged Alia and said, "You made me feel less alone." And that was it. That was the whole reason. Not the headlines, not the lawsuits, but that feeling, that connection. Tanya understood in that moment that change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks into a room as a young black girl with a scar on her spirit, standing tall anyway. That was the revolution. That was the healing. That was the point all along. Years passed. The city was no longer the same, and neither was Tanya. New leadership, new oversight, and yes, new challenges. But people watched now. People spoke up. The silence that once suffocated had been broken for good. Tanya still walked those same sidewalks, now with Alia beside her, taller, stronger, whole. Sometimes strangers stopped them, thanked them. Sometimes they shared their own stories of fear, of injustice, of hope. Tanya listened always. She knew that change wasn't a moment. It was a lifetime of choices, of standing up, even when your knees shake, of telling the truth, even when your voice trembles. She had spent years turning her grief into something greater, and though the pain never disappeared, it transformed into fuel, into purpose, into something that lit a path for others. And every time someone followed it, even one step, Tanya knew this fight, this story, this love, it mattered. It always had. Tanya never set out to be a warrior. She was just a mother who refused to let her child's pain be ignored. But from that hospital room to the courthouse, from city hall to classrooms, she became something bigger, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. And in doing so, she lit a fire no institution could put out. Alia would grow up with scars, yes, but also with strength, with voice, with proof that her life mattered, that her story meant something. And so did every black woman's story. Tanya's fight wasn't just about justice, it was about dignity. It was about making sure no more mothers had to scream into silence. As she looked back at the long road behind her, she didn't see loss. She saw legacy, a truth carved into the bones of a broken system. You cannot destroy what refuses to be erased. And black women, we are never erased. We are the story. We are the fire. We are the future. This isn't just the story of a mother, it's the story of a movement. It's a story about what happens when a black woman decides enough is enough. It's about how love for your child can become fuel for revolution. This is Black Woman Stories, where our truth gets told. Subscribe to hear more powerful stories that deserve to be heard.